There you go. Now hit this and it shares into that. Now I can hear you too because it's sharing this.
Okay.
And this. So you should be ready for that.
Okay, I think we're ready to go. So we are going to go from this point. So I was telling you about my deal where I had the seller, and the buyer came in and he moved into the house 3 months early, paid $6,000 in hard money, and was able to move into the house and then give the sellers the amount of money that they wanted to receive for the home. And so this also leads to another point, which gives the buyer time to get their funds in order. Perhaps they have to sell stock and it has to settle. That takes a few days. Or perhaps they have to gather funds from somewhere else and they need the time to get their funds in order to close and get the deal going. And again, for the buyer, it could be so that they don't have to do a double move and have storage. These are all important things to keep in mind as we're moving forward with pre and post possessions. So now there are some things that we have to consider as agents, going back to the fact that we want to make sure we are doing our best fiduciary duty to our clients. So the first thing that we have to consider is, why does the party on the other side want to do this? What is their reason? Is it something legit, or do they just not get their ducks in order and they aren't ready to move out yet? Is it something that's important? Is it something that's realistic to us that we can see that we want to help them in the accommodation? Is it reasonable? Do they want to stay in the house an extra 2 or 3 days to finish moving and to get the house clean, things like that, to get it ready for the buyer? Or is it totally unreasonable? And the same side on the buyer. You know, do they want to move in 2 weeks early because they just don't want to deal with the double move? Or are they being, you know, inconsiderate to the other party? The other thing to consider is, if you don't do it, will it compromise the deal? Will the buyer or the seller have to walk away? Or if you do it, could something happen and therefore compromise the deal? For example, on a pre-possession, if you let a buyer into the home and they had previously felt the fact that it backed up to the 202 freeway wasn't a big deal, and they get in the home on a pre-possession and they realize they can't stand it and they have to walk away, earnest money or none, and they bail on the deal. So there are things like that that you have to consider before you agree to this type of a pre or post possession. And the next thing is the time. How long does the other party want? Do they need extra time for a valid reason, and how much extra time do they need? Typically, in a situation like ours, our buyers or our brokers do not want us going into a pre or post possession for longer than 30 days. This is to be a short-term deal, and 30 days is kind of the max that they think it would take for someone to be moved. If it is more than 30 days, is a rental agreement a better situation? So the example that I gave you earlier, where I said my client, my sellers let someone move in for 3 months, we actually changed that from a pre-possession agreement attached to the contract to a lease purchase. So we had a rental agreement in place with the contract, and they tied into each other, so that if the rental agreement, the lease agreement, was violated, it then nullified the purchase agreement. So we had ways to protect the buyer and the seller in a case like that. So what is the worst that could happen? Anyone? Bueller, anyone? What's the worst that could happen? There are so many things we could think of. So here's just a few of them. The first thing to remember, that the party in possession becomes a tenant. And even though our documents state that this does not invoke the landlord-tenant laws, if it goes to court, it certainly could. So you have to keep that in mind, and you have to do everything that you can to mitigate the fact that you now have a tenant in the property. So the first thing you want to think about is, what if something happens to the house? You're in the house, and let's say there is a fire. There is a fire in the house. The seller is in a post-possession agreement, and there's a fire. There's damage to the home. So the seller calls his insurance company and says, hey, my house had a fire and I lost all my personal possessions. And the insurance company comes back and says, dude, you sold that house. You don't own that house anymore. Your insurance is null and void. And so then the buyer calls his insurance company and says, hey, I just bought this house and the seller was staying in it for a few days and there was a fire and the house has been damaged and all of the seller's stuff has been ruined and we have to insure it. And their insurance comes back and says, dude, you didn't tell us this was a rental. You don't have insurance to cover this. And now there are lawsuits gonna be flying, all because things weren't done correctly up front to protect both the buyer and the seller. So in a case like this, the buyer, who is now the owner of the house, wants to get landlord insurance. So they want to call their insurance company, say, I bought this house, but the seller has to stay there for a few days and I need to make sure that they're covered. A lot of people don't like to do this because it's a hassle. They think it's not going to work well. The insurance company gets cranky, but you must put landlord insurance on this house to cover both you and the occupant. The tenant, who is in this case the seller, gets personal property and liability insurance. So they want to be able to cover their own stuff. If everything gets ruined, they need to go to their insurance company and get it taken care of. And then they want liability insurance. If somebody falls and breaks their leg on the sidewalk or the dog bites them, you don't want it coming back on you as the buyer. You want that seller to have liability insurance to cover anything that happens while they are in the house. Okay, eviction. What if the worst possible thing happens and the seller decides they love their house or they can't get their new house or something like that goes crazy and they just flat aren't going to move? And now your time for your post-possession has ended and you have these people in your house and you have to get them out. All eviction laws apply. And right now, that is really, really scary because there is a moratorium because of COVID-19 on evictions. So the first thing, if you get the sense that something is going to happen and the occupants are not going to leave, you need to get legal advice. The COVID moratorium on evictions is kind of in flux and it's changing for various reasons right now. But I know that if you are in EXP, the EXP brokers are highly advising that you do not do any pre or post possessions because of the moratorium on evictions. They want you to figure out another way to get through this without having to have somebody being in the house that doesn't actually own it. However, with that says, they do want you to put all proper documentation in place and consider all the risks and try to mitigate them. Lawsuits, well, we know with lawsuits, nobody wins but the attorney. So you want to do everything you can to cover your rear end to make sure you have everything in writing so that it does not go into a lawsuit. You also have to check with the lender. So if you are a buyer and you have closed on this home and it is now your home, you probably signed an affidavit that says you are going to be an owner occupant. And if you have given time to the seller to stay in the house, you need to make sure that you are not violating that owner occupied affidavit and thereby committing mortgage fraud. The time frame that I have seen most often is that the lenders want sooner than 6 weeks for the buyer to move into the house. But every lender is different and you have to check into that, because if it's going to cause a problem legally for the buyer, they need to make sure they know what the restrictions are. So with all of that said, and with all the reasons why we want to run from these deals and not do them at all, we have to still consider how are we going to get it done. So in spite of the pitfalls, what do we do? You can strengthen your buyer's offer in this competitive market. So I had another situation where I represented the buyer. The seller had purchased a new home, it was being built, and they weren't sure exactly what day they were going to have it done. In the listing agreement, it said straight up, we are going to have to do a post-possession agreement that will carry the seller through until their new home is being built. So we knew that going in. So we were able to go in. This was a hot little property. It was $300,000. It was in a great location. It was a single story with a pool, 5 minutes from the buyer's work. So we knew that there were going to be tons of offers on this property, and we went in with informing the seller that we would be willing to do the post-possession. We also had to do an escalator clause. We had to do a couple of things like that, but we got that offer over 18 other offers because we, as the buyer, were willing to do that post-possession to make it easier for the seller. It potentially saves both the buyer and the seller time, money, and work. So if they can save some money, not have to move twice, that's their work. If they can just stay there until things are ready, that's their time and their money, obviously, of hiring movers twice or doing the work themselves, hiring a storage, having to stay in an Airbnb or an extended stay hotel. There are just a lot of reasons that we could help the sellers out. And as buyers in this market, anything we can do to make the sellers like us is what we have to do. In order to make this happen, the most important thing is mutual cooperation between the buyer and the seller. Sometimes in these transactions, we are adversarial and we are trying to get the best for our client, and we are trying to make sure that their needs are met and not necessarily those of the party on the other side. However, in a situation with a pre or post possession, there has to be trust and there has to be mutual cooperation. Both sides have to cooperate with the other to make it work. So how do we do it? How do we make it work? The very first thing we have to remember is you tell your client that they need to get legal advice. They need to talk to an attorney. They need to talk to their tax advisor. They need to make sure that this is a deal that will benefit them in the long run, and they can do it if it means that they're going to be able to get the house. And the other thing is you have to check with your broker. If you are with eXp, we know that they're advising against it right now, but we also know that they do allow it. If you are with a different brokerage, your broker might not even allow this, and it might not even be an option for you. So it's something that you need to know going into it. Those are the two most important things. Once we get past that and we've advised our client in writing to get legal advice and we've checked with the broker, we know we can do it. There are certain documents that we have to put in place to protect our buyers and sellers. The first of these is a pre-possession document from the broker. eXp, we have both a pre-possession and a post-possession document. We're going to go into those in more detail in a minute. Every broker out there most likely has run this by their attorney, and if they allow it, they have their own pre- and post-possession agreements. We also might need contract addenda to coordinate them together, to change the close of escrow date, any of those kinds of things that we do so that we can tie the original contract into this pre or post possession. We have to determine the terms. There's got to be compensation for this. So what is that compensation going to look like? Is it going to be money? Is it going to be furniture left behind? What is it going to be? So usually we have to come up with the amount of time that the other person is going to be allowed to stay in the home. How long is that going to be? We've already decided that for the purpose of these documents, they're going to be staying in that home for less than 30 days. We have to figure out the rental amount. How do you come up with a rental amount for 10 days or 20 days or whatever? For me, what I like to do is I like to talk to my buyers if it's going to be a post-possession. I talk to the buyers and I tell them, let's go to the lender and let's find out how much your mortgage payment is going to be all in. So I want to know how much principal, interest, taxes, insurance, and the HOA bill come to per month. And then I divide that out by 30 to get a daily amount. And then I add $10 a day just for any, for a headache for the buyer, for anything that comes up, for anything that we might need extra. So I use that amount, the daily amount plus $10 to determine the rental amount. And you can do it just the opposite on the seller side if the seller's doing a pre-possession. And then we have to think about deposits. What kind of deposits do we need? I think it's very important, whether you're doing a pre-possession or a post-possession, that you get some kind of deposit. So in my case, where I represented the buyer and the buyer moved in, or the seller stayed later. Well, we had already done our final walkthrough. We had already done all the repairs. But what if the buyers, they had two little kids, or the sellers, what if the sellers are tired? They get there, they've been moving for days, they have two little kids, they're just done. And they walk out of the house and they leave a bunch of their stuff behind that they don't want anymore. And they leave trash in the garage and they don't clean the house. How is my buyer going to be compensated for that? So we get a deposit for that amount of money. So if they have to hire somebody to come and do a trash out, or they have to hire cleaners to come, they've gotten some money to cover that so that the house is in the condition it should have been left in for them. And the last item in this is that we want to use the title company. The title company can collect the rents in advance and either disperse them as a check or disperse them as a credit to the other party at close of escrow. If you're going to use it as a credit to the buyer when they're getting a loan, make sure it's okay with your lender. The title company can hold the deposit and then release it back to the person in possession, and the buyer or the seller don't have to really be dealing with it later. And the final part of this is we have to talk about inspections, repairs, and the final walkthrough. So you know that when somebody moves into the house, they're going to start finding stuff that they did not find in the inspection, that they did not notice in the inspection. Repairs that maybe weren't done to the intent that they thought they were going to be done. And, there's just a lot more stuff that comes up. So we put in writing that when the buyer moves in as a pre-possession or the seller stays as a post-possession, there will be no more repairs required, that this is acting as the final walkthrough and the inspections are done. So the buyers or the sellers cannot go back to the owners and say, oh, by the way, I noticed that this light switch doesn't work and I want you to come and fix this light switch. That is not going to happen. There's actually clauses in the documents that say any repairs that are needed are now the responsibility of the occupant. So EXP, like I said, has both the pre-possession and the post-possession forms. To get these forms, you go into your SkySlope and log in. You go to Working Documents. And that is the last little icon on the page. Then you go, after you go there, you go to the top and you go to Office Documents. And then that opens a drop down. You go all the way to the bottom to Arizona. And then you go past the first page to the second page, and about a third of the way down, you will see the pre-possession and the post-possession documents. I'm going to flip out of the PowerPoint for a second here, and I'm going to go open these documents, and we are going to talk about them. Just kind of go line by line. So we're going to go pre-possession first. This pre-possession document is 3 pages, and it covers all of those little got-yous that we are worried about. Things like the utilities, things like the landscaping, things like the repairs, things like getting legal advice. They are all written in this document, and we want to make sure that we fill it out completely and that we have our clients sign it. So this one is a pre-possession document that the buyer is going to occupy the premises before the close of escrow. So in the beginning, this this form tells us that it is just a courtesy. It is not required to make the transaction, and it might not be in the best interest of the buyers and the sellers. The next thing it tells us is that we as buyers and sellers, that as brokers, that we do not recommend it. Pre-possession agreements are not recommended, and the parties are aware that there are many risks associated with allowing the buyer to stay in the property. And then in bold and underlined, get legal advice. So then as we start to fill it out, it tells us that this is an agreement between the parties with the contract date, the seller, the buyer, the premises address. That ties it into our contract. And then it tells us that the purpose of this addendum is to grant the buyer exclusive possession of the premises prior to close of escrow, depending on the completion of a sale. The following terms and conditions are now included in the contract. And again, as we have discussed, this form is not recommended to be used for periods that are 30 days. In that case, we want to use a rental agreement. So it talks here that the seller is granting the buyer the option to stay here beginning on the date that the buyer is going to be moving in. And it gives them an option. Are they going to occupy the premises with their personal property, or are they just going to store personal property there without occupying the premises? So that could be they have a pod and the buyer just says, look, can I just park the pod on the driveway? Or I have an extra car. Can I park my car in the driveway? Or can I put my lawnmower in the garage? And so there might be some things that they just want to store at the house, or they want to occupy the house as their living arrangement. So here, the next line is the occupancy shall be limited to the following number of adults, children, and pets, and the type of pet. So what if we have 2 adults, 2 children, and oh, the buyers have a pet tiger. Do we want a pet tiger moving into our home? No, we want them to disclose what they have. It might be dogs, it might be cats, but whatever it is, we want to know that those animals are going to be there. And again, that could be important for our insurance policy, especially if they have 5 of the dogs that are on the bully breeds and the insurance company isn't going to cover those. So now here's our what if. In the event close of escrow does not occur or contract is canceled, the buyer's right of possession ends and the buyer will remove the property and vacate the premises no later than 5% on the day after the close of escrow date, or any extensions or the cancellation, whichever is sooner. And now we're getting into the money part. How is this compensation going to happen? Prior to the possession date, buyer shall pay to the seller as compensation certified funds in the amount of, let's say, $50 a day for 10 days for a total payment of $500. Now, if they agree to an extension, you might want to bump that up. It might now be $100 a day. And the buyers and the sellers initial the bottom of the page. Next sentence tells you clearly that the sums paid for compensation are not applied toward the purchase price. And then we talk about if the escrow fails to close by the close of escrow date, buyer agrees to pay the seller 1% of the purchase price per month. So if it's a $300,000 sale, they're going to be paying $300 per month prorated on a daily basis, or we can go back to our $50 or $100 a day. Next comment is talking about the deposit. How much of the deposit is going to be prepaid compensation? And the other thing that I always do in a case like this, where I am doing a pre-possession or a post-possession, or is pre-possession, is the buyer's earnest money goes hard. So if for some reason the buyer does find out that it backs up to the 202 and they can't stand it and they're going to cancel the contract, their earnest money is hard at this point. And if they've only put in a small amount down, as a listing agent, I would require more hard earnest money to protect my seller. The use of the premises is as a personal residence only. Buyer agrees to comply with applicable laws, ordinance, regulations, covenants, creed, and restrictions, and homeowners association rules. If there are any fines, the buyer pays the fines. And I think this is super, super important right now because there is a lot of short-term rentals going on. And we want to make sure maybe the buyer is buying this house to be used as an Airbnb, and it's a hot weekend and they know they can make $670 a night renting it out. So they're going to rent it out for 3 nights. You absolutely don't want any scenarios like that happening. And so it has to be used strictly for their primary residence. The buyer pays for all utility and services. The buyer maintains the condition of the property. They recognize that they have done their final walkthrough, that they are accepting the promises as the way it is. There are going to be no more repairs made, and the buyer is now going to maintain the property. The insurance we've already talked about, but here we put in the amounts of insurance and the coverage limits that are going to be put into place for the buyer to cover their items. All the contingencies are waived once the buyer moves in. So those are financing conditions, financing contingencies. And the only thing that could be left is perhaps the seller has missed one repair, hasn't had an opportunity to get it done, and he's agreed to it. And so the seller can come back in and finish that. The buyer is now responsible to maintain the heating, cooling, mechanical, plumbing, and electrical systems, the pool, spa, landscaping, and ground, and all personal property, maintaining it in substantially the same condition as the date of possession. The buyer is not allowed to perform improvements. So let's say the buyer thinks that the color on the wall is hideous. They want to paint it. They're moving into the house and they want to paint those walls purple. They cannot do that without expressed written consent of the seller and making sure that it's okay. Same goes if they want to change out the flooring, they want to knock down a wall, written consent from the seller in order to make it work. The buyer cannot assign this contract or this addendum. It's only for them and their personal use. And if for some reason the seller has a valid reason to come back into the house with proper notice, the buyer will reasonably grant the seller the right to come back. Unless there is an emergency or it's impractical, the seller needs to give 24-hour notice. Then our favorite clause right here is that the buyer and seller are indemnifying us from legal action. We do not want them to sue us if something goes wrong in this. And then in big, bold letters, we are telling the buyers and the sellers that this does not create a landlord-tenant relationship. So that should something go wrong, we do not have to adhere to the statutes of landlord and tenants. And then we have our signature page. So we would go through, we would fill this entire form out, and then at that time, we would submit it to the title company. Obviously, the other agent has a copy of it, and if necessary, to the lender, so that everybody involved has a copy of this and knows that it is part of the contract. Now we are going to go over the post-possession agreement. We won't go into as much detail because a lot of it is the same, just flipping everything over. So again, we start off, we're saying this is not a good idea, don't do this, get legal advice. Okay, but if you are going to do it, let's do it right. So we add our information here on the contract, the buyers, the sellers, the address, and we go through the same thing. And we talk about the dates that they're going to stay. Are they just going to store some personal property there, or are they actually going to stay there and live there? The number of adults, the number of children, and the pets. And then in the event that the close of escrow does not occur, this agreement is void. Buyers and sellers both initial. Here's where the seller agrees to pay to the buyer the amount of money that you have predetermined. And then if the seller fails to vacate the premises, the seller agrees to pay the buyer the per diem. So if you do $100 a day or $1,000 a day or whatever you decide, the seller now pays that to the buyer. If necessary, the buyer may pursue legal remedies prescribed by law, including attorney's fees, to recover damages and obtain possession of the premises by way of a special detainer action. Now, I was talking to one of my friends who is also an agent and asked her, what is your absolute worst scenario of pre or post possession? And she had some sellers in a home. They were losing the home to a short sale, and they begged and begged the buyer to allow them to stay in the home a couple more weeks. And this agent put her name and her stamp on it that the sellers would be good and they would be moving out on a certain day. But when that day came, the sellers refused to move, and they had to go through legal action. They had to go through eviction, and it took several months before those buyers were able to get possession of that house. So we want to make sure that we don't have any situations like that happening. Like we talked about earlier, the seller also needs to pay a deposit. That money goes to the title company or is held by the buyer in case they need to pay for things that aren't taken care of when the seller moves out. And then if everything is in good stead, the seller gets that deposit within 48 hours, or if the cancellation is canceled. The seller is using this strictly as their personal residence and agrees to abide by laws, ordinances, HOAs, and all of that. The seller keeps the utility in their name. And at this point, the seller gets insurance policies for personal property and liability protection. And we already know that the buyer is going to get landlord insurance. The seller now has to maintain the property in the same condition that they have up to this point. The seller cannot do improvements, which I don't know why they would be if they're going to be moving. The seller cannot assign the property, and the seller has to allow reasonable entry to the buyer if the buyer needs to come into the house for some reason. Again, the seller is giving us indemnification and trying to keep us from getting into legal action. And now we're stating here again that this does not create a landlord-tenant relationship. So that talks about all the different forms that we need. If there's something else that is needed, it could probably be handled through an addenda, but this should protect you to the best reason possible. But you really need to be wise in this and follow your guts. And if you think that there's something going on and it's not a wise thing to do, or you're getting that spidey sense that something is up, follow through on it, make sure that everything is done, make sure that you have all your documentation in order, and that your client, whether it's your buyer or your seller, is fully aware of the legal ramifications and the risks involved in this type of a transaction. So at this point, if you want to, if you had any questions, I don't know if you can send them to me through StreamYard, but just remember that if at all possible, avoid doing a pre or post possession transaction due to the risks involved. Especially now with EXP, the brokers are strongly advising against it. However, it can be a powerful tool if executed properly. So it's just something that can be, you can use it. It's scary the first time. I remember I was here at Revelation, and I was doing my first pre-possession, and I went to Angela and asked her, and I knew she was going to tell me it's a bad idea, don't do it, get out of it. And she said to me, no, this is what you can do to save this deal. I had a house that I had listed for 6 months. I hadn't been able to sell it, and this guy wanted to buy it, but his house in Colorado hadn't sold. And it was the first time I did it, and it was with Angela's guidance and blessings. And I've used it several times in the past, 3 times this year, and it has helped my clients keep their deals together and walk away with the terms that they wanted. So So if you'd like to discuss it further, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name is Kathy Pacheco-Peets with eXp Realty. I am an associate broker. I'm a mentor and a coach, and you can reach me at 602-738-5836. Thank you so much.
Yeah.